Hello, everybody. My name's Deborah Pugh, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation today on coping with behavioral challenges during COVID-19. As we all find our seats and get ready, I'd just like to say how wonderful it is to be joined by people from across the province and further afield. I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but first I would like to just acknowledge the sponsorship of CIRCA, the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research and Collaboration in Autism at the University of British Columbia. We really very much appreciate all kinds of support at the moment. We are doing this presentation today because we've heard from a lot of families that they're finding the situation extremely challenging. Their children don't understand what's coming, why their usual routines are so disruptive, and the parents are finding it really difficult to cope and to be as supportive as they know they need to be with their children because it's so difficult to explain. So we'll go into that in a bit more detail. At first, I want to say that this is, as many of you know, training is what ACT does, ACT Autism Community Training, although what we do is not always specific to autism, and certainly today is much broader and much more relevant to the community at large than simply for children who have autism spectrum disorder. And we want the community to know that we are very interested in welcoming anyone who finds our presentations useful. We have over 60 full-length workshops online, and after this event, you'll be able to see where you can find out more information. You'll also be able to listen to presentations by Dr. Fawcett and Dr. Stock on topics related to this one today. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce our two presenters today to you. Dr. Brenda Fawcett and Dr. Richard Stock are both on faculty at Capilano University in the ABA in Autism program. They both also, and I think most importantly, have many years of experience in working with families and children and through adulthood, because both of them have been around for a little bit of time. So they have worked with families with children from very early childhood until they become young adults. And I think this is a really important factor in how compassionate both Richard and Brenda are to the realities that families face and to the very difficult situation that these children are in. So I think that makes it much more of a family-focused event today rather than an academic appreciation for the seriousness with which families are grappling right now. Dr. Fawcett has an additional asset in her repertoire in that she's an experienced teacher of the deaf. And so she is what I always think of as the queen of visuals. So you'll find that a lot of the information she will present during the beginning or the middle of this presentation will be particularly relevant. So we're going to start with Richard, Dr. Stock, and I'm going to turn over the microphone to him in a moment. Then we'll have Brenda Fawcett presenting. If we have time, we have a few questions that we will come back to at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's a pleasure for both Brenda and I to be here. We're always big supporters of all the good work that Autism Community Training does for children and youth with autism and their families in British Columbia. So today, as Deborah alluded to, I will kind of kick things off and provide some context and then hand things over before the halfway points to my colleague, Dr. Fawcett, to kind of really get into some of the nitty gritty and tangible things that you can walk away to have some tools in your toolbox at the end of our hour today. So in terms of setting context, who are we talking about? Well, autism is obviously a spectrum. There's that saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we're really going to be focusing today on that area of the autism spectrum where children, students are more significantly impacted and they need more significant supports. We're not really going to be talking about students at the other end of the spectrum who really require minimal, if any, supports, who might actually be doing pretty well with emergency remote instruction right now. That is, they're able to manage a schedule and participate in their online classes and things like that. Of course, there's a huge group in the middle of the spectrum who require some type of moderate supports. And I know many of these students, they're able to interact to some degree with emergency remote instruction, whether that's, an hour or two a day, through Zoom or other online means with their education assistant or classroom teacher, special education teachers. So we're not really going to focus too much on them. It's really going to be those students who require significant supports. And these are not the students who, like you and I, can sit in front of a computer and take instruction remotely. They're probably not going to be attending to even familiar faces on the other side of the screen. So the jargon here is these are students who are not able to equitably access remote instruction. So they're essentially being left out of their regular education process. Everything is really falling onto the shoulders of mom and dad. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that burden because it's hard to manage COVID-19 in our own lives, never mind trying to do the entirety of special education at home. So it's to that end of the spectrum that we're really going to be speaking in the next hour. In terms of setting context and talking about us first as the educators before we kind of switch gears over to the focus on the students, here's a quote that I like. It is totally normal right now to be okay one day and struggling the next, or to be relaxed one minute and overwhelmed the next. We are living and working through a global crisis of unprecedented proportions. There's no template for this. So I can resonate personally with this quote. I'm sure that many of you can as well. It reminds me of when you get on an airplane and they give the safety spiel and they say, before you put on your oxygen mask, before you put on your child's oxygen mask, put on your oxygen mask first. And that's kind of the spirit here. So in line with that, this is an important point that Brenda and I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of, whether you're a special educator, a parent, an education assistant. What you are doing is okay, because these are exceptional times. We are trying to get through exceptional times. So whatever you are doing, it is okay. This might be a takeaway poster that you can print off and put on your fridge at the end of today's talk, just to keep reminding yourself that we're all just really struggling to get through this so that we can resume business as usual. And in the meantime, what you're doing is okay. And hopefully at the end of today's talk, you'll feel even more optimistic about that. Over the next 4 slides, I'm going to guide you through some guiding principles, again, for us as the educators, whether you're the parent at home. This applies as well for education assistants, classroom teachers, special education teachers working remotely. First and foremost, this is a surprise for all of us. Nobody signed up for this. Not the social distancing, the tremendous impact and end to our daily lives as usual. The fact that we can't even go shopping as usual, and we're spending so much more time at home and having our kids at home with us, and often without access to the usual supports that we have, so that we're not getting a break. This applies to all families, not just those who have kids at that more impacted end of the spectrum.
Excuse me, Richard. I'm
Yeah.
just going to interrupt you for a second. Did you mean to have your slides shared?
Yes. Can you not see my slides?
No, we cannot.
I need some tech support, Ryan. I think I'm sharing my screen. Chrome tab. No, application window. I think I have it. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Fawcett.
My pleasure. See you later.
There's our spectrum slide. All right, so we didn't sign up for that. We certainly didn't sign up to be emergency homeschool teachers and what was originally called online learning, right? We did not, as parents at home, I imagine there's many parents at home watching this, you didn't sign up to be the education assistant, the special ed teacher, the classroom teacher. So in light of that, I think it's important that we go with the humane option as the best option, that we're really just here to support each other. And I think that this webinar and all the other webinars that ACT has been organizing of late in terms of the COVID emergency response have been great examples of resource sharing and sharing strategies within our community so that we can help each other and recognize that everybody is struggling with this. When it comes to the homeschooling aspect of things, and this applies from K to 12 regular education, we can't just do the same things online. Many assignments and expectations aren't possible or reasonable to do at home. And some of the objectives that seemed really important to do at school don't have the same value at home. So everything has changed. This isn't business as usual. And in light of that, we need to remain flexible and adjust to the situation. Flexibility is something that we often talk about, that we need to teach our students to demonstrate, that our students need to be flexible and not, lack of rigidity. And that's certainly true of ourselves right now. We don't know where this is going. That's part of the stress of it. The trajectory keeps changing, when we might be back at school, when some of the restrictions might be eased. So we just need to allow ourselves some of that flexibility to recognize we're just doing the best that we can until conditions change and improve. So setting some realistic expectations for yourself. Again, everybody is struggling. I think that's important to recognize. A lot of people are trying to shoot for the norm, but this isn't normal times. So your job is not to become your child's special education assistant or teacher or classroom teacher, because we're not doing homeschooling. We're not doing online schooling. A term that I kind of glommed onto early on in this crisis is emergency remote teaching. And I think that's a really powerful point to make. It's not online teaching. At the end of spring break, it was announced in British Columbia that we would be returning to school through online instruction. But if you look at traditional definitions of online instruction is something that is designed to be done online, and a lot of prep and organization goes into online. And it assumes that everyone has the same resources to access the online instruction, and that everyone is a self-directed learner and choosing to be on online instruction. So this isn't that. This is really emergency remote teaching. Or if you prefer, this came across a social media feed last week, emergency virtual learning, just so that you can make a fun acronym of it. What we're doing is EVIL. And I know a lot of teachers have seen that and prefer that one. We are doing EVIL teaching, emergency virtual learning. So does your child understand what's going on? I know many of us, myself included, are watching the news obsessively. We're trying to make sense of what's going on and the continuing impact of COVID and on work and family and income and things like that. There's multiple stressors. And we're watching the news, hoping for some hope and return to normalcy. And since we're struggling with that, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that it's not safe to make assumptions about what a child with autism might be understanding around COVID-19. I've talked to some elementary school students with autism who are significantly impacted by their autism. And in some cases, if you ask, why no school, they're able to reply COVID or there's a virus. But the sophistication, the deeper understanding of that, we're really not sure what's there. Brenda is going to talk a little bit about social stories as one medium for conveying what's going on to students with autism, because understanding can help alleviate some of the stress we would think. One of the things that I've talked about with a couple families and school teams, in terms of making the understanding of the COVID-19 circumstances concrete to the student, is actually, all they understand is I'm not going to school right now, and I don't necessarily really understand why or when I'm going to be able to go back to school. A few families have liked the idea of actually getting in the car and going to the school during the school day so that their child can see that the parking lot is empty and see the playground is empty and get out of the car and go up to the school building and shake that locked door and see that it is actually locked, that experience actually is very powerful because they can see what mom and dad have been saying, that the building is locked, right? I can't go to school right now. Brenda pointed out that it is important to kind of premeditate this with the staff to make sure the building is locked so that you don't show up and people happen to be there and the front door happens to be open. Or maybe that's what you do want. You coordinate a visit with an education assistant or a classroom teacher or a resource teacher to come in and look around and see that most of the lights are off and nobody's here. So I think one of the things to take away from a webinar like this is we might share an example with you and it might be easy to see the example and think, well, that doesn't apply to me. But the idea here is we would encourage you to take some of these ideas and think about how could you make that idea, morph that idea and change it to work for you. So some idea around making the school shutdown concrete to your student. Another idea that's been actually recommended for most people, students in particular, during COVID-19 is to write a journal about the COVID-19 experience. If you think about this as hopefully being a once-in-a-generation experience, it might actually be interesting in the future to look back on your journal of what's gone on. What did you do during COVID-19? And it helps mark the passage of time, which is really the point here. And I'm not suggesting that the students that we're talking about are going to be writing journals about COVID-19, but again, that idea, how can you take the idea and build something from it of marking the passage of time? I know some students, for example, who, if their parents are divorced and they live part-time between mom and dad's home, but something that's often very helpful is to have a weekly or monthly schedule so that they can see that there's no school on weekends and that there's school Monday to Friday, and that these days I'm at dad's house and these days I'm at mom's house. And that allows for some security and predictability for the student. That's very beneficial. And if you take that idea and you put it into terms of COVID, the weekends, of course, have no school, but right now, Monday through Friday has no school. And so your schedule might look something like this. And if text isn't appropriate for the learner you're thinking of, or your own child, then it could be an icon representing school, or an actual picture of their actual school, maybe with the no smoking sign over it to show, right now there's no school. And for the next many days or weeks, as far as we know, there's no school. For some students, you might actually be able to put a question mark at the end of the month that maybe then when we get to that question mark, we'll be able to ask, we'll check in, because things might change. Maybe next month there will be school. So it's really just taking this idea in whatever way works for your individual circumstances in making the passage of time concrete. Because I know we're all struggling with that right now. Sometimes it's hard to remember what day of the week it is. Now, a lot of people I've talked to, because I work with a number of families and school districts, is, well, what about the IEP for these students? If you think about the individual education plan, it was written for learning outcomes that should occur under typical instructional conditions with typical strategies and measurement in school settings. But we are not in typical instructional conditions, and we are certainly not at school. Early on in the shutdown, shortly after spring break, I worked with a number of schools who went through the exercise of taking each individual student's IEP and looking at all the short-term objectives in the long-term goal domains of language and communication and social skills and academics and independence, for example, and try to pick out short-term objectives that would make sense to hand over to the home, that home could work on these. And the overwhelming conclusion of this exercise for most students is there's very little, if anything, in the school-designed IEP that just naturally maps onto home. And for the students we're talking about this afternoon, we might need to kind of let go of the idea that we should be doing the IEP at home and instead think about how do we do meaningful things at home. It's reconceptualizing what our IEP should be. And Brenda will talk a bit more about that. Again, and I've kind of alluded to this, one of the critical pieces that's missing from all of our lives is the loss of our schedule. I'm used to having a very busy, predictable, full schedule that I'm very comfortable with. And the loss of that is very stressful. And you've probably heard that it's a good idea to establish some type of consistent home quarantine schedule for your child. And for the students we're talking about, this really is not going to be based on an academic schedule. It's not that they need to be up and ready for online instruction at 9 a.m., but it is healthy and recommended to have a daily schedule so that you, Monday through Sunday, get up at the same time, consistent meal times, outside time, access to electronics time, consistent bed times. That's something that is usually within our sphere of influence, realm of control, that we can keep consistent when everything else, we've lost that consistency. So it's really this macro idea of having a family schedule. And then Brenda shortly is going to talk about, in the context of that schedule, involving your child on things that you're already doing. Brenda and I have often reflected on the experience where we're working with often teenagers or young adults with autism, many of whom have developed a very well-developed skill repertoire. They're doing very, very well. They have a tremendous number of skills, but then we'll hear that there's some simple thing, often a daily living thing, that they can't do. And we're often surprised that they can't do that, given they can do so many other things. And we talk to the family about it. The usual story is, well, we've just been doing that for them their whole life, and we've never really thought about getting them to do it. We've never really just given the opportunity to do it. So if we're looking for a silver lining while we're stuck at home in quarantine, involving your child or finding small ways to involve your child in things that you'd otherwise do for them can be a very powerful idea to provide some structure. And again, Brenda will talk a lot more about that. So since we can't do business as usual, the regular IEP at school, if we want to think in terms of what should your home emergency remote teaching IEP, so to speak, look like, it would really start with having that family consistent schedule that offers predictability and safety and comfort. And then in the context of that, involving your child in those naturally occurring daily activities to the extent that you can based on the skills and abilities and age of your child. I'll share a quick clinical anecdote and then I'll hand it over to Brenda. A number of years ago, a trainee and I were contacted by a team for a young adult, a young man who was in his early 20s. He wasn't that far out of high school, and he was quite impacted by his autism, and he lived in a self-contained apartment, and he had 24/7 care. There was an adult with him 24/7. Every 8 hours, the staff would change. And I call it the gilded cage because it was a very nice apartment, but it became like a cage because all he did was sleep and eat and watch TV and go on his iPad, kind of like a lot of people are doing in COVID-19. We've already recognized for most of us that there's that gets old pretty quickly, and we get a little stir crazy, and we need more than just sleeping and eating and going on electronics. And this young man started to engage in some pretty significant problem behavior, including aggression towards staff and property destruction. So when we were called to address his problem behavior, we kind of backed off and looked at his living circumstances and recognized the problem behavior is really just a symptom of he doesn't have anything to do. He's a passive recipient of life. Everyone's doing everything for him. And our first recommendation was for the staff to create a regular schedule, get up at the same time every day, go to bed at the same time, but then get involved in every little aspect of the day, from making the bed, going shopping, carrying the groceries home, putting them in the shelves, participating in meal prep and meal cleanup, and doing some laundry and doing some vacuuming. And the staff were a little hesitant at first because they thought, well, that's a lot of work you're going to get him to do. And we just looked at it as it's something for him to do. And a few weeks later, we checked in, and to their credit, they ran with that idea, and they were ecstatic. They said, we have no more problem behavior, and we're way more happy to go to work. And he's way happier as an individual because he has something to do all day long. He's involved in his day, which of course was very appropriate to his age in his early 20s. We're not expecting that for all of you at home for that to be applicable to everybody, but it's the idea. How can you, and if you look at what you're doing for your child on a daily basis, pick one thing. Think about, could I get my child involved in that, if not more independent outright in completing that thing? So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Fawcett. Have we transitioned over to Brenda?
Hi, I think this is what we would call a technical problem. So we're just going to may I ask you a question, Richard, sort of a follow-up while we get Brenda back on, and I'm sure that I will be interrupted, and we will both be glad to be interrupted by Brenda when we have the opportunity. As a follow-up to what you were just talking about, did they also try to get this young man more engaged in the community in terms of things that he could do outside the home?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention, he liked to go for walks and he liked to go and ride public transit, but given the option of lying on the couch and watching TV, he often wouldn't choose to do those things. But when they built it into the schedule that, you know, every day at 1 o'clock, we're going to go out and walk for an hour, or if it's raining, we're going to get on the bus and ride for an hour. He was quite amenable to that once it was built into the schedule and was predictable to him. And so that was another part of kind of breaking out of the gilded cage, is he had a life in his apartments and some responsibilities, and he was actively engaged instead of a passive recipient of life, as well as outside of the apartment, getting out there and in the community.
Right. Now I'm going to ask you a question that we had lined, while we're waiting for Brenda, I'm going to ask you a question that we had lined up for the end of the show, if we had time. So the question was, question number one, how can parents cope when individuals, you know, we're talking mostly young children here, but it would apply across the age range. We have a lot of young people who, as you've described, are very distressed because they don't know what's going on. How can families support them, especially when they're being aggressive, perhaps to their siblings or parents, or, you know, destroying objects? You know, obviously this is from their frustration. Considering the new triggers that's arriving, you know, from COVID-19, how can we better support these children?
Great question. And just to let you know, I've received a message from Brenda saying that the power has gone out in her neighborhood.
Oh,
we
dear.
Didn't foresee that.
Okay, this is called, so Brenda's telling us she can't present. We've had some interesting times in this series, but we will be calm. You know, we will model calm behavior. We'll be flexible. Richard, I'm going to suggest that you take Brenda's slides and that we go through those. Would that be, because you have them, would that be sensible, do you think? And just,
well, I'm not sure how sensible it'll be, but I'll try a little bit. I'm not sure. I'll try to do it justice for Brenda's sake, but it's really stuff that she's the expert in, is prepared, but I'll try and run with it. Would you like me to address that question before I?
Perhaps we can go to, answer the question, and then hopefully she'll have her power back. If not, we'll go through her slides. And what we'll promise the audience is we'll bring Brenda back on another day if the power doesn't come back, and maybe allow her to expand on it. Does that make sense?
Excellent. Absolutely.
Okay.
Look at me being flexible. Okay. So the question is about aggressive outbursts towards themselves, towards family members and objects, and all the new stressors with COVID-19. How do we support these kids? Coping with aggressive behaviors at home directed towards family and property is very stressful under the best of conditions, under normal conditions, no question.
And Richard,
course, yeah.
Richard, can I, no, just ignore me. Go ahead. It's stressful under normal conditions. Go ahead. Thank you. Yeah.
If we were called in as a behavior analyst, of course, to address particular problem behaviors, and we were providing consultation, we'd be starting with a contract, of course, and functional assessments to figure out what the function of the problem behavior is before making treatment recommendations. And so in the absence of that, of course, I cannot answer this question in terms of child-specific advice, but just rather in terms of broader things to be thinking about. So since I can't provide clinical recommendations, let's just think about how we can conceptualize this problem. And if we're thinking about the change to our lives and schedules caused by COVID-19 as a setting event, that might be a good place to start. And if you're not familiar with the idea of a setting event, it's a concept in positive behavior support where you look at events that cause us to have bad days or to be more on edge than usual. So for example, if I had a bad sleep and I have low blood sugar, then my tolerance for dealing with things might be different than if I'd had a good sleep and didn't have low blood sugar, right? So setting events aren't the cause of problem behavior, but they kind of set the stage for problem behavior. And I think COVID-19 and the disruption to our lives is one big setting event. I was talking with a family recently where the first week after spring break, I checked in for a high school student, and mom said he's kind of living his best life. He's doing quite well with this. He's checking in with his special education assistant every morning for a few minutes, and he's doing some stuff at home. He gets to sleep in a bit. He's loving it. And then a few weeks later, the honeymoon was over, and I heard from the family again, and they were having very significant problem behaviors that they haven't seen in years and years and years. And when we looked at the kind of the context for these behaviors, it wasn't just that his school had been disrupted, but he couldn't ride transit, he couldn't go to the library, he couldn't go to the pool, he couldn't go to his usual social skills groups or Canucks autism events. So the entirety of his life had been exploded. It was gone. His predictability and scheduling was gone. And really, that just functions as one big, massive setting event. Now he's really on edge, and things at home that really haven't set him off and been triggers for a very long time were suddenly triggers again. And so that's one way to conceptualize COVID-19 and the impact on our lives. It's one big setting event. So a few simple things that a family could consider in the face of setting events is simply reducing expectations, right? If you're having a bad day, then I might just remove some of the usual demands that I would otherwise put on you because it just doesn't make sense today. It's not worth it. I've had some conversations with some school district staff in terms of kids who have problem behavior at school that are often precipitated by demands. And if they have problem behavior at school when there's demands, it really doesn't make sense to take those same demands and try to do them at home, right? That's just really asking for trouble. there's no value in that. And so just remove those triggers. So changing and removing common triggers. And another strategy that kind of fits in terms of setting events is just increasing reinforcement overall, increasing access to preferred things, increasing reinforcement for things that usually wouldn't need to be praising or reinforcing for. But these are just aimed at reducing problems in the short term until conditions can start to get back to normal. Because again, we're just trying to get through the current circumstances.
That's very good, Richard. Now, I have decided completely arbitrarily that what I'm going to do is appeal to Brenda to what we'll do is consider this part one of a two-part presentation. I'm going to get you to answer another question. But then I think what we're going to do, if Brenda doesn't come back within about, and I'm just getting a message from here, isn't this exciting? She's saying, I can do it another day. And that's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask, I'm going to get you to answer this next question, and then we'll figure out, we'll reschedule Brenda and we'll give her a whole hour to discuss this, which I know she can do with no problem. So the next question we have is from a parent whose child is normally really physically active and is finding it really difficult to have this child or to keep him occupied and properly engaged when it sounds a bit like having a caged lion. And I think a lot of us feel that way. Those of us, unlike myself, who was a couch potato, but for those kids who are really active, what suggestions do you have for encouraging activity in the home in a safe way?
Some activities to burn energy and occupy time. That's a great question. A phrase I commonly use is we are only limited by our own creativity. And this is where I really value being part of a team, because this is a question that really invites creative responses. And there's a lot of people who are way more creative than I am. So if we're thinking about this creatively, we're just making a list of possible ideas to engage at home. One idea would be to buy or use a treadmill. My family and I bought a really cheap, chintzy treadmill on sale at Canadian Tire at the beginning of the lockdown, just so that we would have some way of getting some exercise. So there's an idea that would require an expenditure. There are, I know, talking with some school teams, electronically facilitated play dates through Zoom or MS Teams and things like that. I've heard some examples of families and teachers organizing YouTube workouts and then facilitating it through Zoom or MS Teams, where a child with autism and one of their preferred peers from school, someone who's known to them, might be connected electronically to do a short fitness workout, something like that. So these can be done to include education assistants, sometimes the teacher, peers ideally. I know some families who are organizing this just within the family. The Canucks Autism Network, of course, often has great resources. CAN has been posting videos of activities and exercises, so I'd really encourage people to check that out. A lot of it, again, when it comes to we're only limited by our own creativity, is taking advantage of existing resources instead of making things up on our own. So I'd really encourage people to look at Canucks Autism Network. Organizing backyard relay races within the family, investing in a mini trampoline, finding some mini hand weights that you could use in activities around the home or on the trampoline or things like that. That's just off the top of my head. Again, we're only limited by our own creativity. And one of the challenges with a circumstance like this is some of these ideas might work for an individual, but then they're going to wear out and you're going to have to come up with new ideas. And so I would encourage people to kind of network to the extent that they can for ideas to get some group think to help determine some ideas.
And I think that I've seen some great ideas on Facebook, and I would recommend anybody who's participating today in this or later who could offer ideas up that we can share. That would be terrific. So what I'm going to say, I'm just going to have a look, quite a short note here. I don't think, poor Brenda, this must be awful for her. Brenda, if you can hear us, we are sympathetic. What I think we're going to do is to reschedule Brenda and possibly bring Richard back for the question and answer period. We're not quite sure exactly what's going on, but we will bring Brenda back if not next week, the week after. We'll have to check with her schedule. Richard, I want to say thank you very much for rolling with the dice here as we try and provide families information that is useful to them, and for the parents and caregivers who are watching us today. We welcome your ideas and suggestions and comments, and we would like to remind you that we have, I think, 3 full days of Brenda on on Autism Videos at ACT, and 2 full days of Richard. Those are free presentations. Although I think we've done fairly well today, the quality in terms of audio, visual, and organizing is very high. We have a professional team that does that with professional equipment. And even better, we have all those videos organized in 5 to 10 minute clips and properly labeled. So you can go through those at your own schedule over the next few weeks, and you might find I think you will find things there that you'll find extremely useful. So once again, Richard, thank you for rolling with the punches on this one. And Dr. Fawcett, we look forward to seeing you over the next couple of weeks, and we'll get that scheduled very soon. So with no further ado, I want to say thank you to everybody. Bye
Thank you.
now.
I encourage everyone to come back for Brenda.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.